Hey guys, tonight we step into tombs never fully uncovered, where entire dynasties vanish into the desert sands. Beware, you probably won't survive this without feeling tiny. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, drop your location and local time in the comments, because trust me, it matters whether you're staring at this on a humid Cairo evening or a quiet, snowy street halfway across the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the hot, cracked earth of the Nile's banks, where the wind carries a fine, sandy dust that gets under your eyelids and into the corners of your mouth. Imagine walking over the exact spots where kings once marched, their sandals kicking up the same reddish dirt, leaving impressions that have been erased by centuries of sun and wind. You can almost hear the faint clatter of pottery being moved, the distant bleating of goats in mud brick courtyards, the whispered conversations of scribes recording names that time has chosen to forget. Egypt's history, as you probably learned in school, starts with a neatly organized first dynasty, Narmer, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. But tonight, we're not interested in the well-lit corridors of textbooks. We're slipping into the shadows, into those pharaohs who never made the history books, or only barely. There are rulers whose tombs were swallowed by shifting sands, whose stelae broke in floods, whose very existence was questioned by later scribes. Mainstream history counts 31 dynasties before the Persian conquest, but historians still argue whether all those kings truly existed, or whether some were mythologized placeholders for periods of chaos. That's your first taste of ambiguity, right at the edge of certainty, and it's exhilarating. You stoop over a fragment of pottery, the sun warming the shards beneath your palms. Hieroglyphs curl across it like lazy snakes, telling stories you can almost, but not quite, decipher. Some tell of kings with odd titles you've never seen elsewhere, like He Who Walks Behind the River, or She Who Watches the Stars. Fringe Egyptologists whisper that these fragments hint at entire dynasties erased from collective memory. Kings who might have ruled for decades, but whose names were deliberately forgotten. You shake your head, smirking, because part of you knows you're holding a puzzle that even seasoned archaeologists haven't fully solved. There's a quirk here that makes your heartbeat quicken. Some pharaohs might have been buried with nothing more than a hastily dug pit and a few ceremonial objects. Others had lavish tombs, yet the shifting Nile and later tomb robbers stripped away almost everything. Imagine wandering into a desert valley, finding a lone limestone slab inscribed with a name no one remembers. How small you'd feel, how utterly alone in the presence of lost power. You try to picture the throne, the gold, the ritual headdresses that must have gleamed in the torchlight of their time. But all you see is dust. You pause near a mound that rises slightly above the flat horizon. Archaeologists call these buried horizons, little rises that may conceal dozens of tombs. Some were looted in antiquity, some never explored, their secrets still waiting under layers of sand, hardened like cement. There's a certain eeriness here. The air is heavy with centuries, maybe millennia, and you wonder how many kings, just as real as Tutankhamun or Ramses II, slipped through history's fingers because of floods, plagues, or political purges. Historians still argue whether the early dynastic record is incomplete due to poor documentation or deliberate erasure. You take a slow breath, the dry wind scraping your throat, and feel the first subtle chill of awe as the sun tilts lower, casting long shadows across the desert. You realize that these missing pharaohs are everywhere. Their ghosts are in fragments, in pottery, in the outlines of tombs that no one has fully uncovered. You imagine a king reclining in a darkened chamber, his scribes already dead, his palace crumbled to dust, and wonder if the desert remembers him at all. Fringe stories suggest that some of these lost kings were even worshipped locally for centuries after their political power faded, their cults surviving in whispers and half-forgotten rituals. The idea makes you smile. A pharaoh's afterlife doesn't necessarily depend on recognition from modern historians, just on memory, fleeting, fragile, but persistent. The Nile curves nearby, its water slow and greenish, carrying with them reeds and the occasional hint of fish. You might think of this as life continuing in defiance of forgotten royalty. The river has seen empires rise and fall, kings appear and vanish, and you feel somehow connected to that long, unbroken rhythm. Imagine walking along its banks at night, stars reflected in the water, your footsteps echoing against a silence so profound it almost hurts. That's the kind of intimacy with history that makes missing pharaohs so thrilling. They are absence made tangible, gaps that spark your imagination more than any intact tomb ever could. There's even humor in it, if you let yourself notice. You picture a king whose only surviving artifact is a chipped jar, and you can't help thinking, well, at least he left one thing behind for archaeologists to squabble over. And yet, the joke is bittersweet. Every fragment you hold, every half-erased name, carries the weight of centuries, reminding you that history is not only what survives, it's also what's deliberately, tragically, and sometimes comically lost. You step back and take in the horizon, the desert stretching infinitely, the Nile carving a ribbon through it. You realize that tonight, you're the closest thing to a witness these missing pharaohs might ever have. Mainstream Egyptology can give you timelines and dynastic tables, but you, here, in this imagined encounter, are tasting the air of their era. It's dry, it's warm, it's slightly abrasive, but it's alive with possibility. And that's why, even though you probably won't survive without feeling tiny, you can't help but linger a little longer, hoping the desert might whisper a name, a story, a secret, just for you. You push onward from the last mound, the sun softening as it begins its lazy descent, and step into the pre-dynastic shadows, the hazy, uncharted beginnings of Egypt, before Narmer ever thought of unifying upper and lower. Here, the Nile isn't a tame river, flanked by temples and bustling towns. It's a wild, meandering vein of life, unpredictable and at times, violent. You trudge along its banks, reeds brushing your shins, waterlogged mud sucking at your sandals. Imagine small villages of mud brick huts, smoke curling from simple hearths, children laughing or crying, while adults work the fields with flint sickles, oblivious that in a few millennia their descendants will carve Pharaohs' names into stone. You probably won't survive the boredom of imagining this every day, but you try anyway. This is the age when kings didn't yet wear crowns of gold. You wander among cemeteries so small, they would barely fit in a modern backyard. And yet the burials here hint at hierarchy. Some skeletons lie with stone tools, others with exotic shells or pottery, and occasionally you stumble upon the earliest silt-covered signs of ceremonial practice. A painted palette, a carved figurine. The mainstream fact: pre-dynastic Egypt, roughly 6,000–3,100 BCE, already shows social stratification, trade, and ritual. You kneel over a tiny grave, imagining someone's life cut short. Maybe a chieftain, maybe a commoner, who knows? And you feel a shiver, because these are the ancestors of those missing kings from Section 1. Their shadows ripple forward through time. Quirky little tidbit. Some pre-dynastic palettes depict what look like wrestlers, animals, and even the occasional boat with faces staring from the prow. One scholar suggested these could be early cartoons, an ancient Egyptian sense of humor buried in mud and ochre. You squint at a fishy face carved into stone and can't help but grin. Maybe someone, thousands of years ago, was just messing with posterity. They were already pranksters, long before internet memes. There's ambiguity too. Historians still argue whether these small villages represent a single cultural evolution or multiple parallel proto-states that would later coalesce or collide into unified Egypt. You wander from one pottery shard to another, trying to imagine political alliances forming over barley fields or disputes over fertile Nile patches. Perhaps one village's leader briefly claimed divine status, or maybe multiple chieftains shared power in a delicate, unwritten negotiation. You feel the tension in the air, the ghostly pressure of leadership long forgotten. You come across a mound larger than the rest, dirt and reeds piled haphazardly. Could it be a proto-tomb? The fringe idea whispers in your mind. Some of these mounds could belong to rulers whose names were never recorded, pharaohs before the concept even existed. Maybe one of them is the missing king of Dynasty 0, whose existence is still hotly debated. You crouch down and brush the dirt aside, revealing fragments of red ochre painted in geometric patterns. Whoever was buried here must have been important to their community, though the scale is small, intimate, no grand pyramids yet. The quirk: some of these burials include cosmetic palettes, perhaps the first hints that vanity or status was a human constant. Imagine ancient Egyptians fussing over mud and minerals to make themselves presentable for eternity. The Nile, ever present, murmurs beside you. You dip your fingers into the water, and the coolness bites against your sun-warmed skin. You can almost hear the river laughing, carrying the seeds of civilizations yet unborn. Maybe someone once floated down these same waters, uniting upper and lower in imagination. Long before Narmer ever set foot on a throne, historians still argue whether pre-dynastic trade networks connected villages so tightly that political unification was inevitable, or if it was a fragile, contingent series of coincidences. You tiptoe across the mud, feeling the slippery promise of early human ingenuity underfoot. And then there's the small, charming oddity. Some archaeologists have found miniature models of boats, cattle, and grain stores buried with the dead, almost like toys. Were these ritual offerings? Or was someone just really bad at gifting? You chuckle quietly to yourself, imagining a pre-dynastic child burying a tiny boat for the king of their dreams. It's easy to forget that even the earliest Egyptians had a sense of play, an urge to leave behind a story. No matter how small, the air grows cooler as the sun dips further, shadows stretching across reed-lined banks. You imagine a pre-dynastic chief squatting in his mud brick house, watching the same sun set over the Nile, oblivious to the empire his descendants might build. And yet, in the quiet, you realize that these small beginnings, the forgotten villages, the tiny graves, the painted palettes, cast long shadows forward. Every missing pharaoh you will meet in later sections owes a debt to these early dreamers, warriors, pranksters, and ritualists. Their existence is subtle, ephemeral, but utterly foundational. You pause to breathe, the river scent and earth mingling in your nostrils, feeling strangely connected across millennia. There's humility here, a slow, satisfying ache of perspective. You are tracing the first tentative steps of kingship itself, before crowns, pyramids, or dynasties. Pre-dynastic Egypt might seem small, mundane even, but its whispers echo through the ages. And tonight, you are the listener, wandering among shadows that gave birth to gods, kings, and the missing pharaohs who would come later. You follow the pre-dynastic shadows northward, where the mud and reeds begin to give way to faint stone outlines. And suddenly, the first real whispers of structured rule emerge. These are the early dynasties, the first and second, or perhaps some lost figures lurking in between, that populate Egypt's transition from scattered villages to recognizable kingdoms. You can almost smell the faint incense burned at tiny altars, see the flicker of oil lamps reflecting off crude limestone walls, hear the tentative scribblings of early record keepers who were trying desperately to pin names to kings who might already have been slipping from memory. You probably won't survive this level of historical ambiguity without your imagination going haywire. But that's the fun part. Mainstream Egyptology tells us that the first dynasty begins with Narmer, but already the record is fragmentary. Names like Horaha, Jer, and Den survive only on broken palettes, inscriptions, or jars found in cemeteries at Abydos. You kneel beside one of these excavated tombs, imagining the heat of the desert sun on your back, the smell of dried mud mixing with incense, and the meticulous care of workers who built funerary chambers for kings whose power is now largely symbolic. Historians still argue whether some of these early rulers were actually mythologized figures, retroactively inserted into dynastic lists to create a sense of continuity. Basically, ancient PR campaigns you can't fact check. There's a quirky tidbit that will make you grin. Some early dynastic palettes depict what look like battles between men and animals, with figures that appear to be wrestling crocodiles or leading lions on leashes. Fringe theorists have suggested that these might indicate ceremonial pharaoh animal contests, bizarre rituals to demonstrate a king's prowess, or maybe just ancient cartooning, much like the fish-faced pre-dynastic palettes. You crouch to trace the outlines of these carved warriors, wondering if anyone ever imagined future historians staring at these tiny carvings and thinking, yep, this proves the king wrestled a crocodile. You wander among mastabas and small step pyramids that predate the grandeur of Giza. Some tombs are mere mud brick chambers. Others show early experimentation with limestone and orientation along the Nile. The burial goods are modest: jars of grain, a few stone tools, perhaps a cosmetic palette or two. You can practically feel the tension in the air as the royal families attempt to project power without yet having perfected monumental architecture. Historians still argue whether the rapid evolution from these small structures to grand stone tombs reflects internal dynastic ambition or the influence of neighboring cultures along the Nile Delta. You brush a layer of dust from a carved lintel and imagine the pharaoh who once strode through these corridors, his sandals echoing on stone floors, now gone. A little-known quirk of the early dynasties is their fascination with duality: Upper and Lower Egypt, chaos and order, life and afterlife. You notice inscriptions of paired animals, mirrored motifs, and twin-headed symbols, all hinting at a worldview where balance was sacred. Some fringe scholars argue these designs were attempts to appease gods whose names we no longer know, or even proto-logos for political propaganda, signaling to neighboring regions that the king's authority was absolute in both lands. You step back, shading your eyes from the sun, and realize that these early kings were already weaving myth and politics together in ways you barely understand. The cemeteries reveal another tantalizing aspect. The size of graves varies dramatically, even within the same period. Some kings are buried in lavish chambers with finely crafted artifacts, while others lie in near anonymity, their names inscribed only on small pots. The mainstream reading suggests a society experimenting with hierarchy and ritual. The quirky side whispers about political intrigue, assassinations, or rival factions quietly erasing names. You shiver as you crouch over a fragmented tomb wall, imagining scribes quietly chiseling out a name under orders from a rival king. Historians still argue whether these missing or altered inscriptions were intentional acts of political censorship or simply the result of poor preservation. You notice the tiniest traces of life: charred reeds from a long extinguished hearth, tiny footprints of children in dry mud, scratches made by animals, but they anchor the human experience across millennia. You imagine a day in the life of an early dynastic family. A king issuing decrees in a small courtyard, his consort weaving cloth, scribes recording events on mud tablets, and workers moving stones for a future tomb that will never survive. Some fringe accounts even suggest that early dynastic kings occasionally reigned simultaneously in competing regions, a proto-interregnum that foreshadows later missing pharaohs. The idea of parallel rule makes your head spin slightly. A dual monarchy before unification? Or just the messy reality of human politics? The sun dips lower, casting the tombs in golden light, shadows stretching across the sand. You walk carefully, mindful of the fragile artifacts beneath your feet, and imagine kings whose power is now a whisper. Some were likely forgotten within decades, overshadowed by successors whose names dominate monuments and texts. And yet, fragments endure. Palettes, pottery, inscriptions, tiny echoes of authority. The quirky part of your imagination whispers, maybe one of these forgotten kings had a reputation for loving cats so much that local priests built shrines to feline divinities in his honor, a devotion lost to time, but visible to your modern eyes in a small, carved relief. You take a deep breath, inhaling the warmth of the desert mingled with faint incense, and feel the connection across the centuries. The early dynasties were experimental, fragile, and sometimes contradictory, but their ghosts haunt every subsequent king, queen, and missing pharaoh. In these shadows, you glimpse ambition, fear, artistry, and mischief, the first steps in a long, complex dance of rule and remembrance. You probably won't survive the realization that even these kings, who built the foundation for Egypt's iconic civilization, are now mostly invisible. But that's exactly what makes your walk among their tombs so intoxicating. You trudge northward along the desert edge, where the sand shifts like liquid gold under the lowering sun, and arrive at the enigma that scholars call Dynasty Zero. You can almost hear the sighs of ancient scribes, long dead, as you crouch over shards of pottery and fragments of palettes, whose inscriptions hint at kings that may or may not have existed. This is the time just before Narmer's unification, a place of political experimentation, tribal rivalries, and proto-monarchs testing the limits of their authority. You probably won't survive this mental tightrope without feeling dizzy from uncertainty, but the thrill is in that dizzying fog. Mainstream historians acknowledge Dynasty Zero as a term for rulers who appear on artifacts yet are absent from later king lists. Names like Scorpion, Double Falcon, and Bull flash across the archaeological record in fragments of ceremonial palettes and tomb inscriptions. You kneel beside one of the largest pre-dynastic tombs, imagining a king reclining on reed mats, while attendants fuss over his sandals and ceremonial scepter. Historians still argue whether these figures were actual monarchs, symbolic tribal leaders, or entirely mythic constructs, later retrofitted into a historical narrative. The uncertainty gnaws at your curiosity, but also sharpens it, because nothing about this period is tidy or predictable. The quirky tidbit, one of the so-called Scorpion King palettes, depicts him wielding a mace and tending a vineyard. Or is it a ceremonial scene for a harvest festival? Fringe Egyptologists have suggested that these depictions might indicate early ritual kingship, where agricultural oversight was just as sacred as warfare. You squint at the tiny carvings, trying to decipher whether you're seeing a literal vineyard or a symbolic metaphor, and a grin spreads across your face. It's both hilarious and humbling. kings so obsessed with their grapes that they earned eternal fame, or confusion on stone pallets. You wander among rudimentary tombs, their chambers dug in the desert mounds, some lined with rough limestone blocks, others merely pits in the sand. Burial goods are sparse but meaningful. A few ceramic vessels, a carved mace head, fragments of cloth. These early rulers may not have worn the double crown yet, but they wielded authority in ways that would shape Egyptian politics. Fringe theories even suggest that Dynasty Zero kings occasionally ruled in parallel over competing proto-states, proto-Upper and Lower Egypt conflicts that would later crystallize under Narmer. You imagine secret negotiations, occasional skirmishes, and the constant tension of multiple leaders claiming divine right simultaneously. A little-known quirk: some Dynasty Zero burials contain cosmetic palettes shaped like fish or animals, hinting at the very early Egyptian obsession with symbolism, status, and maybe vanity. Perhaps these rulers, though largely lost to history, cared deeply about appearance, much like a celebrity obsessing over social media likes today. Except, in their case, the afterlife was the platform. You crouch to study one palette, imagining a king applying ochre to his face, preparing for eternity in a dusty tomb that will soon be buried beneath shifting sands. The Nile's whispers reach your ears, a slow murmur beneath the wind, reminding you that life continues even when human ambition is lost to memory. Historians still argue whether Dynasty Zero represents an actual sequence of kings or merely a period of symbolic or ritual leadership with no centralized authority. You trace your fingers over a fragment showing a king with a staff, a falcon motif hovering above. Was he a real person or a proto-god whose image was meant to inspire obedience? The ambiguity makes the desert around you feel alive, like it holds secrets just beyond comprehension. And then there's the strange, delightful speculation. Some believe these early kings were worshipped locally for centuries after their death, their cults persisting in whispers and minor rituals, yet leaving no monumental evidence. You grin at the image. Villagers still baking bread in honor of a king whose name you might never learn. The rituals quietly dying with the last generation who remembered him. It's charming, it's mysterious, and it makes you feel like you're part of a secret conversation across millennia. You step back to look at the horizon, dotted with small mounds and faint stone outlines. Each could conceal a tomb, a forgotten ruler, or nothing at all. Your imagination stretches to fill the gaps, conjuring kings who perhaps never existed, or who were real and deliberately erased. Mainstream scholars piece together timelines from pottery styles, inscriptions, and burial patterns, yet gaps remain wide and tantalizing. And that's what Dynasty Zero offers you. The thrill of walking the line between certainty and speculation, holding fragments of eternity in your hands, while the desert swirls around you. As the sun dips further and shadows stretch like fingers across the sand, you sense the weight of these forgotten rulers. They are prototypes, experiments in kingship that informed the structure, rituals, and politics of dynasties to come. Some fringe theories even suggest that Dynasty Zero may have included rulers who influenced religious symbolism for centuries. Long after their political authority was gone, you feel a pulse in the silence. The Nile flows, the desert hums, and history remains stubbornly incomplete. And tonight, for a few precious moments, you're among the witnesses to kings who exist only as shards of pottery, echoes of maces, and whispers of vineyards. You wander further into the desert, past the dunes that shimmer like molten gold in the late afternoon sun. And suddenly, the landscape changes. Small pyramids, some little more than stone piles, others reaching modest heights, rise like ghostly silhouettes against the horizon. These are the hidden pyramid builders, kings, and minor pharaohs, whose tombs never made it into the grand narratives of Giza or Saqqara. You probably won't survive the sheer humility of standing beside these overlooked monuments without feeling the weight of obscurity pressing on your shoulders. But that's exactly why you keep walking. Mainstream Egyptology recognizes a series of early pyramid constructions before the Great Pyramid of Khufu. Djoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara is famous, yes, but many smaller, obscure pyramids remain, built by pharaohs whose names are barely legible on fragmented stelae. You crouch at the base of a tiny limestone pyramid, running your fingers over weathered blocks, imagining the laborers who cut, hauled, and assembled each stone under the scorching sun. Historians still argue whether these small pyramids represent fully recognized kings, local rulers claiming royal status, or experiments in architectural evolution. Each possibility tantalizes your imagination, and the desert hums in agreement. A quirky tidbit makes you pause and grin. Some hidden pyramids are oriented in ways that align with stars no longer in the same position. Fringe researchers suggest that these pyramids may have functioned as early observatories, or even as celestial calendars, blending tomb construction with astronomical practice. You tilt your head back, imagining an early Egyptian astronomer squinting at the heavens, while a nearby worker mutters about moving yet another block of limestone. An eternal dance of science, devotion, and hard labor. You trudge around the pyramid's base, noticing small pits and trenches, evidence that some were looted long ago. Some pyramids were never finished. The upper layers of stone crumble in the sand, leaving jagged outlines like teeth. Inside, burial chambers reveal little more than pottery shards and broken tools. Perhaps the pharaoh was modest, or perhaps the tomb was stripped by robbers who found little worth stealing. Fringe theorists even propose that a few of these pyramids were symbolic, constructed to project power over a region without the expense of monumental burial. You lean against a worn block, feeling the heat radiate through your fingers, and wonder at the ambition that drove people to erect pyramids that might never be remembered. There's a strange quirk about some hidden pyramids. Small figurines and cosmetic palettes have been found in unexpected configurations, as if the builders were experimenting with ritual design. Some palettes show what look like tiny boats or animals. Others carry abstract symbols whose meaning is lost. You imagine a pharaoh supervising the placement of each object, perhaps asking, "Does this boat point north enough?" And can't help but chuckle at the thought. Even kings, obsessed with eternity, had to worry about the little details. The Nile hums nearby, a green ribbon in the sandy expanse, reminding you that life continues even as monumental ambition is lost to time. You notice that many hidden pyramids are located away from the main centers of power, in valleys and plateaus that are hard to access. Historians still argue whether this reflects political fragmentation, rival kings staking claims in peripheral lands, or personal preference, a desire for solitude in death. You crouch by a collapsed chamber, inhaling the dust and imagining the unseen ceremonies performed here. The scent of incense, long vanished, but lingering in memory. A fringe suggestion adds even more flavor. Some of these minor pyramid builders may have been related to better-known pharaohs, perhaps siblings or rivals, whose brief reigns were deliberately erased by successors. You can almost picture a younger brother, frustrated at being relegated to a smaller pyramid, scowling as he watches the construction of his elder sibling's monumental tomb from afar. The desert holds these secrets well, letting you grin at the absurdity of dynastic sibling rivalry, echoing through millennia. As the sun sinks lower, casting elongated shadows across jagged stones, you step back and take in the cluster of hidden pyramids. Each structure, though small and overlooked, whispers ambition, ritual, and human ingenuity. These pyramids are a reminder that Egypt's history isn't just about colossal monuments and famous pharaohs. It's also about the minor rulers, the experimental builders, and the forgotten dynasties whose labor shaped the landscape and whose names may never be known. You run your hands along the warm stone, imagining the hands that placed each block, the sweat and chants, the prayers and disputes, all now silenced beneath centuries of sand. A faint breeze brushes across your neck, carrying with it the whispers of laborers, priests, and kings long gone. You imagine the sun rising over these pyramids tomorrow, then the next century, and wonder how many eyes will pass them without noticing, how many footsteps will erase traces yet again. The quirky, humbling realization hits you. For every Khufu or Djoser celebrated in history, dozens of hidden pyramid builders labored with equal devotion, now invisible, their shadows stretching across millennia in silence. And tonight, standing among them, you are their witness. You leave the sun-baked pyramids behind and wander toward a valley where the desert swallows entire settlements, like sand pouring into a glass. These are cursed tombs and lost cities, places whispered about in local folklore, places where even the bravest tomb robbers sometimes hesitated. You probably won't survive the chill of imagining these ruins at night without a shiver running down your spine. But there's a thrill in that fear, the sense that the desert itself has memory. Mainstream archaeology has documented many such lost sites, settlements buried under centuries of wind-blown sand, temples collapsed into rubble, and necropolises looted in antiquity. Tombs at places like the Valley of the Kings in later eras were built atop older, forgotten burials, their original occupants erased or stolen by both time and human hands. You crouch near a crumbling stone doorway, tracing faint hieroglyphs that no longer makes sense. Historians still argue whether the legends of curses that supposedly protected tombs were ever taken seriously by the ancient Egyptians, or if later writers exaggerated them to frighten would-be grave robbers. A quirky little detail makes you chuckle nervously. Some of these curses weren't elaborate inscriptions, but simple warnings like, "Death awaits he who disturbs this tomb," etched on pottery jars or stone stelae. Fringe researchers suggest that some of these warnings may have been psychological deterrents, an early form of security signage, or maybe just a bored scribe having fun with superstition. You imagine an ancient worker snickering while carving, "You will be eaten by crocodiles," on the tomb wall, fully aware that the real threats were thieves and the sun. Walking further, you notice a lost city partially exposed after a rare desert windstorm. Mud brick walls crumble in jagged patterns, streets traceable only by faint impressions in the sand, and a few pottery shards hint at domestic life that ended abruptly. Maybe this was abandoned due to famine, flooding, or conflict. You'll never know for sure. Historians still argue whether some of these desert cities fell victim to climate shifts, Nile course changes, or political collapse. You pick up a fragment of painted plaster and let your mind wander to families huddled in these streets, cooking over fire pits and telling stories about their kings, unaware that history would forget them. There's an eerie quirk in some of these tombs. Skeletons have been found arranged in strange postures, with jewelry and amulets scattered in ways that seem ritualistic, yet defy explanation. Fringe Egyptologists speculate these might represent local beliefs about the afterlife that never became mainstream, forgotten practices that died when dynasties fell. You crouch over one tiny grave, imagining a solitary priest performing rites while the city slept, rituals that would vanish along with him. It's oddly comforting and unsettling at the same time. The ghosts of daily life and devotion etched into silence. You trudge through narrow streets of the lost city, the wind carrying the scent of dry mud and distant reeds. Every broken wall, every toppled column is a story half told. Mainstream accounts note that some cities near ancient trade routes thrived briefly before vanishing, swallowed by shifting sands or rerouted rivers. You notice tiny canals that might have fed gardens, and pottery jars marked with glyphs. You can almost read. It's tangible proof that these weren't mythic places. They were lived-in, breathing spaces, now only visible to those patient enough to look closely. A fringe theory adds more intrigue. Some lost cities may have been abandoned intentionally by rulers seeking to erase a rival dynasty's influence. You imagine a victorious king ordering the relocation of populations, the dismantling of monuments, the erasure of street names, a master plan of historical invisibility. The quirk, traces of graffiti or hidden inscriptions, sometimes survive. Tiny rebellions of memory that whisper, "We existed." You grin, thinking how petty and human the past was, even under the desert sun. As the sun dips lower, casting long shadows across toppled walls and sunken courtyards, you pause to take it all in. Tombs, cities, and scattered artifacts form a mosaic of absence, a history of silence punctuated by echoes. You can almost hear distant chants, the laughter of children, the clang of metal on stone, as artisans labored on tombs and temples, all long gone. Some tombs were intentionally buried, others simply lost to time. But all share one thing: a story incomplete, waiting for discovery or imagination. The desert around you hums softly, carrying the memory of lives, kings, and rituals. Fringe theories suggest that some curses may have been real deterrents, perhaps linked to poisonous substances or clever traps. But you can't help but smile at the idea of a scribe inventing curses to scare away intruders. You feel the weight of lost history, the fragility of human memory, and the thrill of standing among ruins that no one remembers fully, yet still speak to you. Tonight, you are a witness to what the desert never forgot, tracing the edges of cursed tombs and lost cities, aware that every step might reveal a fragment of a story that will never be whole. You rise from the sand of lost cities and continue along a narrow ridge, the wind whispering against your ears as if carrying the voices of rulers long forgotten. Tonight, you meet the obscure female pharaohs, queens, and regents who briefly wore the double crown but left almost no trace in the official records. You probably won't survive the realization that even in a male-dominated hierarchy, women occasionally seized power, if only briefly, without the monuments or inscriptions to immortalize them. But that fleeting brilliance is part of the allure. Mainstream history acknowledges a few powerful female rulers, like Sobek-Neferu and, of course, Hatshepsut, but many others vanish into obscurity, their names erased or misattributed in king lists. You crouch beside a tomb whose owner's gender is inferred only from skeletal analysis and scant inscriptions. You imagine her seated on a low throne, adorned in fine linen, a crown in hand, ruling with quiet authority, while male officials whispered gossip behind closed doors. Historians still argue whether some of these women ruled in their own right, or merely as regents for underage sons, an ambiguity that mirrors the shadows of the missing pharaohs you encountered earlier. A quirky detail makes you grin. Some of these queens were buried with elaborate cosmetic sets, including malachite eye paint and kohl applicators, hinting that royal vanity transcended gender. Fringe scholars have even suggested that certain feminine depictions in early monuments might actually represent female kings disguised as male to conform to tradition. You lean over a small carved stela, imagining a queen commissioning artists to depict her in masculine regalia, and can't help but smirk at the clever subterfuge. You trace your fingers along the base of a small step pyramid, likely belonging to one of these obscure female rulers. Its modest size, compared to grand male pharaoh pyramids, may reflect political constraints, or perhaps deliberate modesty, but it still emits a quiet dignity. Inside, burial goods are often minimal, yet symbolic. Ceremonial daggers, jewelry, and figurines that suggest ritualistic importance. Historians still argue whether the limited artifacts reflect scarcity of resources, deliberate erasure by successors, or a ritual ideology unique to female rule. You step carefully, mindful that the faint carvings could collapse under pressure, a physical metaphor for the fragile legacy of these women. A fringe quirk adds depth. Some obscure queens may have engaged in short-lived military campaigns, their victories recorded only on ephemeral graffiti or symbolic depictions on ceremonial objects. You crouch to examine a shard depicting a figure in a war stance, wondering if it was once a queen leading troops or merely a symbolic representation of her divine power. The ambiguity tickles your imagination. She could have been a warrior, a tactician, or simply mythologized after death. The Nile hums faintly in the distance, and you picture these queens overseeing irrigation, managing laborers, or negotiating alliances with neighboring tribes. You can almost feel the tension. A woman asserting authority in a world built to ignore her, balancing ceremonial obligations with the raw necessities of rulership. Fringe researchers even propose that some of these women ruled entirely in secret. Their power exercised from behind screens and whispers, leaving minimal physical evidence, yet altering dynastic outcomes profoundly. A tiny amusing detail: some cosmetic palettes in their tombs depict playful animals or abstract motifs, suggesting that even in life or death political struggles, these queens had moments of whimsy. You imagine a queen applying green malachite under her eyes while chuckling at a carved cat chasing a mouse. An ancient form of stress relief, perhaps. It's a comforting, humanizing thought, one that makes their obscurity feel less like erasure and more like mystery. As shadows lengthen across the ridge, you step back and take in the subtle grandeur of these modest tombs. They whisper authority, resilience, and ingenuity, and their quiet presence reminds you that history is never solely written by those who dominate the monuments. Even fleeting rains leave traces, subtle fingerprints on dynastic progression, hints that power was not always bound by gender. You probably won't survive the quiet thrill of standing among these forgotten rulers without feeling humbled. But that's precisely the point. In their absence, their influence still resonates, a testament to courage in the face of invisibility. You continue your trek along the Nile's western edge, the sun now low, casting long shadows over cracked mud brick ruins. Tonight, you enter the missing Middle Kingdom, a period that should feel like a bridge between dynasties, yet much of it is fragmented, mysterious, and frustratingly incomplete. You probably won't survive without a headache if you try to make sense of every missing inscription, every blank space in the king lists. But there's a strange thrill in tracing the gaps themselves. Mainstream history identifies the Middle Kingdom as roughly 1650 BCE, a time of reunification after the first intermediate period's chaos. Pharaohs like Mentuhotep II and Amenemhat may stand as familiar markers, yet large swaths of rulers are barely documented, their reigns reduced to a few fragments of papyrus or pottery. You crouch beside an abandoned administrative building, imagining scribes recording grain shipments and taxes, their ink fading long before anyone could appreciate it. Historians still argue whether gaps in the record reflect lost materials, deliberate erasure, or political instability? Perhaps a combination of all three. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some Middle Kingdom tombs were adorned with miniature boats and model granaries, even in the absence of monumental architecture. Fringe scholars suggest these models may have served as magical proxies for prosperity in the afterlife. A practical workaround when resources or political chaos made grand tombs impossible. You run your fingers over a tiny clay grain bin, imagining a pharaoh or noble, hoping their afterlife would be well fed, even if the living world was uncertain. The ruins of small pyramids dot the horizon, their stones partially reclaimed by the desert. Unlike Old Kingdom pyramids, these structures are often modest, and some Middle Kingdom rulers were buried in hidden tombs to avoid looters, a fact that both frustrates and fascinates archaeologists. You trace a faint inscription along a weathered wall, perhaps a royal name lost to history. Historians still argue whether the secrecy of these tombs was a response to internal threats, external invasion, or a new funerary ideology emphasizing hidden power rather than monumental display. You stumble across fragments of papyrus with faded hieroglyphs. They hint at bureaucratic reforms, trade agreements, and diplomatic correspondence with Nubia and Levantine neighbors. The quirky aspect: some letters include references to minor pharaohs whose names appear nowhere else, leading fringe researchers to speculate about shadow kings who may have ruled simultaneously in different regions. You imagine rival courts operating in parallel, each claiming legitimacy, and the absurdity of multiple pharaohs existing quietly, like secret overlords whose influence survived only in bureaucratic fragments. Walking further, you encounter a necropolis where tombs are scattered, inconsistent in style and orientation. Some contained richly painted coffins, others only a few vessels and figurines. Mainstream archaeology notes that Middle Kingdom rulers experimented with tomb layouts, reflecting both innovation and insecurity in political life. You imagine a pharaoh pacing in a partially constructed tomb, instructing architects on the placement of chambers while worrying about rivals who may have erased predecessors from memory. Historians still argue whether these erasures were systematic purges or just accidents of survival. A fringe quirk: a few Middle Kingdom tombs display miniature figurines of dwarfs and exotic animals. Some suggest these were attendants in miniature for the afterlife. Others propose they symbolized magical guardians against tomb robbers. You grin at the idea. Ancient Egyptians, like you today, loved a bit of whimsy, even in death. Maybe the pharaoh looked at the tiny figurines and thought, "At least someone will keep me company when no one else remembers me." As twilight descends, the air grows cooler, carrying the scent of Nile mud and faint incense from long collapsed temples. You realize the missing Middle Kingdom is a liminal space, a twilight of kings and courtiers who left hints but no full narratives. Their influence is subtle yet persistent, shaping administrative systems, religious practices, and mortuary customs that later pharaohs would inherit. Standing among ruins and fragments, you feel the hum of a civilization knitting itself back together after chaos, experimenting with governance, burial, and power. You probably won't survive the disorientation of seeing both continuity and absence. But the exhilaration comes from tracing shadows of rulers. Almost, but not entirely, lost to time. You trudge along a narrow, rocky path overlooking the Nile floodplain, the evening wind carrying the faint scent of dust and drying reeds. Tonight, you explore the mysterious interregnums, those curious gaps between dynasties where pharaohs vanished, records vanish, and Egypt's chronology is punctuated with silence. You probably won't survive trying to piece together who ruled when without feeling dizzy from uncertainty. But the thrill is in the gaps, the quiet spaces where history seems to hide its secrets. Mainstream history acknowledges that interregnums were periods of political fragmentation, often following the death of a strong ruler or the collapse of centralized authority. For example, between the Old and Middle Kingdoms, and again before the New Kingdom, power splintered among regional governors, nomarchs, and competing claimants. You crouch beside a partially collapsed mud brick administrative center, imagining local leaders negotiating alliances, haggling over fertile Nile territory, and attempting to legitimize themselves through rituals and minor inscriptions. Historians still argue whether these interregnums were chaotic collapses or merely shifts in how authority was exercised across Egypt. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some interregnum-era tombs contain miniature weapons, figurines of animals, and oddly shaped pottery, hinting at ritual practices you can barely comprehend. Fringe Egyptologists speculate these artifacts might have been protective charms for rulers whose authority was tenuous, or symbolic attempts to maintain cosmic order during uncertain times. You pick up a small clay dagger and imagine a provincial king praying it would safeguard his line, or maybe just hoping it looked intimidating to rivals. You wander through the remnants of small fortresses, their mud brick walls half swallowed by sand. They were built hastily, likely as defensive measures during regional unrest. Mainstream archaeology notes that interregnums often coincided with external threats from Nubia or the Levant, forcing rulers to fortify quickly. Historians still argue whether these fortifications were practical military necessities or ritualized displays of authority meant to impress both subjects and enemies. You step carefully over crumbled ramparts, imagining soldiers standing guard under a harsh sun, watching the horizon for signs of intrusion or rebellion. A fringe quirk adds intrigue. Some interregnum-era inscriptions suggest ephemeral rulers who reigned for months or even weeks, leaving barely a trace. Some scholars even speculate that these flash pharaohs may have been puppets installed by powerful priests or nomarchs, their names erased deliberately after a short tenure. You can almost see a young, ambitious governor crowning a friend for a week, only for that ruler to be forgotten when the political tides shifted. The absurdity makes you smile, but it's a reminder that power is fragile and sometimes absurdly fleeting. Walking among the small cemeteries, you notice that some burials are unusually modest, while others include elaborate goods despite the instability of the period. This inconsistency fascinates you. Even in interregnums, ambition and ritual continued, sometimes flourishing in miniature forms. Fringe theorists argue that these variations might indicate competing local traditions, with each region attempting to assert legitimacy in absence of a central pharaoh. You crouch over a broken pottery jar, imagining a priest trying to appease multiple gods simultaneously, uncertain which one held sway in a land divided by absence. A subtle, quirky observation: some tombs from interregnums contain miniature boats and figurines of servants, much like earlier and later periods, suggesting a persistent belief in provisioning the dead. Perhaps even fleeting rulers worried about their afterlife, meticulously arranging tiny servants and vessels, knowing their earthly power might vanish within months. You grin at the thought: ephemeral kings still obsessed over eternity, human vanity surviving chaos. The wind carries soft whispers through the ruins, as if echoing debates between long-gone scribes and rulers. You feel a pulse of history in the emptiness, the tension of power lost and regained, the fragile continuity of civilization amidst disorder. Historians still argue whether some interregnums were local phenomena, restricted to Upper or Lower Egypt, or part of a broader systemic instability spanning the entire Nile Valley. You watch the shadows stretch across the mud brick walls, realizing that these empty spaces, paradoxically, teach more about resilience and adaptation than any intact monument could. As night falls and stars begin to emerge above the desert, you linger among the ruins, listening to the soft whisper of sand shifting over forgotten walls. The mysterious interregnums are more than gaps. They are moments of experimentation, negotiation, and fleeting brilliance. You probably won't survive the dizzying thought of all the rulers who came and went in silence. But standing here, you sense the heartbeat of a civilization learning to endure, even when its kings vanish. The emptiness is alive, and tonight, you walk in its rhythm. You trudge eastward along the Nile, where the river widens into glittering channels and the horizon shimmers with heat. And tonight, you follow the traces of a vanished Nubian influence. Those moments when Egypt's southern neighbors left faint, enigmatic marks on pharaonic culture. You probably won't survive this without realizing that ancient Egypt was never isolated. The Nile was a highway, not a wall, and kingdoms rose and fell under mutual influence, trade, and sometimes outright conquest. Mainstream history notes that Nubia to the south was both a supplier of gold, ivory, and exotic animals, and a political force whose rulers occasionally claimed authority over parts of Egypt. You crouch by a fragment of pottery adorned with geometric designs, unlike anything you've seen further north, imagining Nubian traders negotiating with Egyptian officials, exchanging luxury goods and cultural ideas, while the sun beat down on their shoulders. Historians still argue whether Nubian kings directly ruled portions of Egypt during the first intermediate period, or if their influence was primarily economic and ceremonial. A quirky detail catches your attention. Some Nubian burials contain figurines of dancing women, often holding musical instruments, suggesting that rhythmic celebration was a staple of their rituals. Fringe theorists suggest that these artistic expressions may have influenced Egyptian temple ceremonies, giving rise to certain festival dances or musical traditions that appear in later dynasties. You imagine Egyptian scribes awkwardly trying to mimic these dances, perhaps stepping on a few toes, centuries before classical choreography ever existed. You wander among small fortifications along the Nile's edge, their mud brick walls partially collapsed under centuries of flooding and sand. Some contain Nubian-style pottery, while others show Egyptian iconography mixed with southern motifs, a clear visual blending of cultures. Historians still argue whether these mixed artifacts indicate co-rule, trade partnerships, or temporary military occupation. You brush sand from a carved stone, noticing motifs that resemble both Egyptian gods and Nubian deities, and feel a thrill at spotting cultural overlap in these ephemeral traces. A fringe quirk. Some scholars suggest that Nubian rulers may have temporarily adopted Egyptian funerary practices, building tombs oriented to celestial bodies, incorporating miniature boats, and placing symbolic figurines alongside the deceased. You crouch over a small tomb, imagining a Nubian king meticulously arranging figurines for the afterlife, perhaps consulting Egyptian priests or scribes on correct ritual procedures. The thought of cross-cultural collaboration or competition in funerary rites feels intimate and oddly human. Walking further, you notice traces of settlements with mixed material culture, Nubian-style jewelry, Egyptian-style mud brick houses, and imported stone vessels. You can almost picture the daily life. Nubian craftsmen carving amulets, Egyptian scribes keeping accounts, children running barefoot through shared courtyards. Historians still argue whether these communities were ethnically integrated or politically mandated, whether they represented cooperation or subtle domination. You pause to imagine a festival where music, dance, and ritual blended both cultures. A fleeting moment of syncretism, long forgotten. A charming quirk. Some Nubian artifacts include depictions of exotic animals, like giraffes or antelope, which rarely appear in northern Egyptian art. Fringe theories suggest that these images might have symbolized divine protection or social prestige, signaling connections to the wealth and resources of Nubia. You smile, imagining an Egyptian envoy, marveling at the strange beasts and sketching them hastily to show back home, possibly exaggerating their size for a dramatic effect. As the sun lowers, the Nile reflects molten gold, and you sense the faint pulse of vanished kingdoms. Nubian influence, though often overshadowed by the grandeur of Egyptian monuments, left subtle but enduring traces in art, trade, and ritual practice. You probably won't survive fully grasping the depth of cultural entanglement without staggering, but standing here among fragmented pottery, sun-baked walls, and faded iconography, you feel the invisible hand of history at work. Egypt may have dominated the chronicles, but the South's whispers are woven into every fragment, shaping dynasties, ritual, and memory in ways historians still debate. The desert wind rustles through reeds, carrying echoes of distant Nubian songs and ceremonies. You pause, tracing your fingers along a pottery shard, realizing that these vanished influences are more than footnotes. They are evidence of cultural negotiation, exchange, and subtle power. Tonight, you walk in the spaces between kingdoms, noticing the traces of a people whose memory lingers in sand, ink, and stone. You follow a narrow, winding path along the riverbank, the hum of the Nile beneath your feet, like a slow heartbeat. And tonight, you step into the world of lost religious leaders, priests, prophets, and oracles whose names have vanished, but whose influence shaped early Egyptian spirituality. You probably won't survive the realization that temples and rituals sometimes outlasted even kings, and that entire priestly lineages could disappear without a trace. But that's exactly why this exploration feels electric. Mainstream history recognizes powerful priests who wielded real political and spiritual authority, especially during periods of weak pharaonic control. You crouch beside a collapsed temple foundation, imagining a high priest instructing novices in ritual chants, arranging offerings, and interpreting omens that determine the flow of life along the Nile. Historians still argue whether some of these lost leaders acted as kingmakers, pulling strings behind the scenes, or were merely administrators codifying religious tradition. The ambiguity adds a tangible tension to every stone fragment and faded inscription. A quirky detail: some priestly tombs contain figurines depicting ritual dances, bizarre hybrid animals, or miniature altars, suggesting that even in their solemn duties, these leaders enjoyed a touch of whimsy, or at least artistic expression. Fringe theorists propose that certain unusual iconography may represent secret rituals or mystical knowledge deliberately hidden from the uninitiated. You crouch over a tiny carved, lion-headed figure and imagine a priest whispering incantations only he understood, a private power that leaves no trace except stone and imagination. You wander along eroded steps that once led to temples, noticing hieroglyphs faded to near invisibility. Some carvings hint at rituals involving celestial alignments, animal sacrifices, and offerings to gods now partially forgotten. Historians still argue whether these lost leaders initiated localized cults that survived only in oral memory, or influenced broader pan-Egyptian religious structures. You imagine novices following a senior priest through chants, incense curling into the hot air, their devotion leaving a faint imprint on history, even if names vanish. A fringe quirk: some temples of lost priests were constructed underground or in hidden valleys, perhaps to protect sacred knowledge from outsiders, or to conceal controversial rituals. You crouch at the entrance to a half-collapsed subterranean chamber, imagining torchlight flickering over walls carved with symbols whose meaning you can't decipher. The mystery is thrilling. Maybe some of these religious leaders were political innovators, prophetic visionaries, or eccentric mystics. Or maybe, like you, they simply enjoyed a good hiding spot. Walking further, you notice traces of votive offerings scattered among ruins. Small pottery jars, figurines, and miniature boats intended for the afterlife. These humble artifacts suggest devotion that transcended the ephemeral fame of kings. Mainstream accounts suggest that priestly influence was particularly strong during periods of dynastic transition, when the ruler relied on spiritual authority to legitimize power. Historians still argue whether certain rituals attributed to kings were originally innovations of now forgotten priests. You feel a chill imagining the power of unrecorded individuals shaping entire civilizations while leaving scarcely a trace. A charming quirk. Some carvings depict priests with exaggerated features, oversized eyes, or elongated limbs, hinting at symbolic or mystical significance rather than realistic portraiture. Fringe scholars suggest that such stylization could represent spiritual perception, insight into hidden truths, or even mystical authority that transcended mortal identity. You grin, imagining a priest gesturing dramatically while novices try not to laugh. The combination of ceremony and subtle humor stretching across centuries. As twilight falls, the Nile gleams like molten silver, and you trace the outline of a collapsed sanctuary. The lost religious leaders remain invisible, yet their fingerprints persist in rituals, art, and the continued reverence of gods. You probably won't survive realizing that their subtle authority shaped dynastic politics, influenced kings, and guided societal belief without ever earning a place in history books. But that's the power of shadows. Standing among eroded columns, you sense the silent pulse of devotion, creativity, and influence that continues to whisper across the sands. Tonight, you witness the echo of unseen hands that molded the spiritual landscape of ancient Egypt. You move through the dust-choked ruins of what was once a bustling royal district, the desert wind carrying whispers of silk robes and ceremonial chants. And tonight, you follow the trail of disappearing royal families, dynasties that vanished almost entirely, leaving only fragments of their legacy. You probably won't survive the sense of loss without feeling a pang of wonder at how entire lines of kings and queens could be erased. But the thrill lies in chasing the ghosts of memory through sand and stone. Mainstream history documents a number of royal families who seemingly disappear after brief reigns, particularly during times of political instability, foreign invasion, or dynastic upheaval. Tombs are left incomplete, inscriptions are erased, and genealogical records vanish. You crouch beside a partially exposed burial mound, imagining a young pharaoh nervously consulting priests, while advisors whisper about succession crises and rival claimants. Historians still argue whether the disappearance of these families was deliberate, erasure as a political tool, or merely a result of time, neglect, and natural decay. A quirky detail draws your attention. Some tombs from vanished lineages include small, peculiar amulets shaped like tiny sandals or miniature furniture. Fringe scholars suggest these items may have been intended to provide comfort to the deceased in the afterlife, or to symbolically assert the family's continued presence despite political erasure. You pick up a tiny clay chair, imagining a child of a lost pharaoh sitting in it centuries ago, a tiny gesture of normalcy amidst dynastic chaos. Walking further, you notice that some abandoned palaces bear faint traces of architectural innovation, hidden stairways, secret chambers, or unorthodox layouts. Perhaps these families experimented with new forms of courtly design or security, only to vanish before their innovations were fully realized. Historians still argue whether the abrupt disappearance of certain families prompted subsequent rulers to adopt stricter succession protocols, or whether these gaps represent merely coincidental misfortune. You trace your fingers over a carved doorway, imagining courtiers walking through it for the last time, unaware that history would soon forget them. A fringe quirk. Some researchers propose that disappeared royal families may have relocated quietly to remote provinces, continuing influence in exile. Pottery and inscriptions in distant settlements hint at possible lines of shadow royalty, maintaining authority outside the capital. You grin at the thought. Exiled pharaohs, sipping tea, or more realistically, grinding grain, while plotting a comeback that never happened. The notion humanizes the vanished, painting them as persistent but ultimately fragile figures. You stumble across a tomb shaft, partially looted, its chambers nearly empty. Miniature figurines, cosmetic palettes, and ceremonial tools lie scattered, as if the occupants had been hurriedly removed, or perhaps ritualistically abandoned. Mainstream archaeologists note that these incomplete burials are common among families wiped from power, suggesting either hurried death, political purging, or later reuse by succeeding dynasties. Historians still argue whether these disappearances were accompanied by subtle ritual obliteration, symbolic denial of the afterlife, or practical reuse of scarce burial space. A subtle, quirky observation. Some discarded objects hint at domestic life rather than grand statehood. Tiny combs, painted wooden animals, or miniature jars. Fringe Egyptologists speculate that these artifacts might have been attempts to preserve personal identity amid dynastic erasure. You chuckle softly, imagining a queen or prince carefully placing these items in a tomb, thinking, if history forgets us, at least the cats survive. As the sun sets, painting the desert in molten amber and shadow, you step back to take in the faint outlines of abandoned palaces and tombs. Disappearing royal families are a humbling reminder that power is fragile and memory is selective. You probably won't survive fully absorbing the quiet tragedy of dynasties lost to time. But standing here, among scattered bricks and eroded inscriptions, you sense the echoes of lives lived at the pinnacle of society, then abruptly erased. Their silence is profound, yet it teaches a paradoxical lesson. Absence can be as instructive as presence, and the desert remembers what we often forget. Tonight, you walk among the shadows of vanished royalty, tracing lines of influence that linger only in fragments. You descend from the rocky desert into the lush, fertile expanses of the Nile Delta, the air thick with the scent of reeds, mud, and slowly rotting vegetation. And tonight, you search for the hidden tombs of the Delta, burials long concealed beneath silt, water, and human neglect. You probably won't survive without imagining the painstaking effort required to dig, decorate, and protect these tombs in a region constantly reshaped by floods. But that's the adventure, chasing history through shifting mud and reeds. Mainstream archaeology notes that the Nile Delta was densely populated in antiquity, yet far fewer tombs survive compared to Upper Egypt. Many were swallowed by river silts or eroded over centuries, making delta burials particularly difficult to locate. You crouch beside a faint mound barely rising above a marshy field, imagining priests performing rites while local farmers tend to crops nearby. The sound of waterfowl echoing in the distance. Historians still argue whether the scarcity of monumental tombs reflects lower wealth in the region, environmental challenges, or deliberate prioritization of Upper Egypt as the royal heartland. A quirky detail catches your attention. Some delta tombs contain painted ceramics showing whimsical scenes of daily life, farmers dancing, children chasing animals, and even crocodiles wearing crowns. Fringe scholars speculate that these light-hearted images were symbolic, intended to ensure joy and protection in the afterlife. Or perhaps an early form of storytelling integrated into funerary practice. You smile, imagining a scribe giggling as he painted tiny crocodiles, thinking the gods might enjoy a little humor too. You trudge through a partially sunken burial chamber, walls coated with mud plaster now cracked and peeling. Artifacts include miniature boats, pottery, and occasional fragments of jewelry. Nothing on the scale of the grand tombs of Thebes, yet intimate and revealing. Historians still argue whether delta tombs represent local rulers, minor nobility, or overlooked pharaohs whose reigns never extended beyond the region. You imagine a regional king overseeing his crops and canals, performing rituals in his modest tomb, content with security rather than grandeur. A fringe quirk. Some delta burials include ritual masks or figurines made from unusual materials, crocodile teeth, shells, or even imported stones. Researchers suggest that this may indicate a blending of local traditions with broader Egyptian funerary practices, or even early experimentation in magical protection. You crouch over a tiny shell mask, imagining it gazing back at the world, silently guarding a body no one remembers. The combination of practicality and ritual artistry feels uniquely delta. Walking further, you notice the telltale signs of repeated flooding, mud layers interspersed with pottery shards and collapsed walls. These tombs were sometimes abandoned or hastily rebuilt, leaving a jumbled archaeological record. Mainstream archaeologists emphasize that the delta's dynamic environment contributed to a unique burial culture where impermanence was accepted and monuments adapted to shifting lands. Historians still argue whether this influenced the region's political prominence or if it merely reflected environmental necessity. A charming quirk. Some delta tombs show evidence of playful funerary graffiti, tiny animals etched into walls, abstract patterns, or miniature boats drawn with exaggerated oars. Fringe Egyptologists suggest these were intended to animate the afterlife, providing amusement or protection for the deceased. You grin at the idea, picturing a young apprentice carving a cat into the wall, hoping it would keep company with the king or noble entombed there. As twilight deepens, the delta glimmers with golden reflections in the marshes and canals. The hidden tombs here are modest, enigmatic, and easily lost. Yet they whisper of daily life, devotion, and creativity long forgotten. You probably won't survive fully grasping the interplay of environment, ritual, and politics without being humbled. But standing among sunken mud brick tombs and scattered artifacts, you sense a civilization adapting, preserving, and experimenting in a land of water, mud, and mystery. Tonight, the hidden tombs of the Delta invite you to imagine the lives and afterlives of those quietly buried beneath rivers and reeds, their stories obscured but not entirely gone. You trudge past marshes and crumbling mud brick walls, the desert giving way to scattered limestone outcrops. And tonight, you confront pharaohs erased by later kings, those rulers deliberately obliterated from monuments, tombs, and chronicles by successors seeking to rewrite history. You probably won't survive without feeling a chill at the thought of powerful individuals erased as completely as chalk drawings in the rain. Yet the thrill lies in reading the ghostly traces of their existence. Mainstream history acknowledges that erasure, or damnatio memoriae, was a common practice in ancient Egypt. Hatshepsut, for example, was methodically removed from many monuments after her death, though later historians rediscovered her reign. You crouch beside a partially defaced relief, imagining a scribe carefully chiseling out a pharaoh's name while soldiers keep watch, aware that each strike symbolically unmade a ruler. Historians still argue whether these erasures were motivated purely by political rivalry, religious orthodoxy, or personal vendettas. A quirky detail: some erased monuments retain faint outlines of figures, leaving ghostly traces of what was once celebrated. Fringe theorists suggest that these residual images may have been seen as vessels for lingering spiritual power, unintentionally preserving fragments of the condemned ruler's essence. You tilt your head, squinting at faint lines carved into limestone, imagining the original pharaoh still watching through a veil of stone. Walking further, you encounter a small tomb whose entrance has been plastered over, likely to obscure a lineage from history. Inside, you find a few broken pottery shards and a tiny figurine, its original owner now invisible to official records. Historians still argue whether such deliberate concealment was always political or sometimes ritualistic, a way to control memory in life and death. You brush away centuries of dust, feeling the tension of a story almost lost, a lineage erased but lingering in fragments. A fringe quirk: some researchers propose that erasure sometimes backfired, as subsequent rulers unknowingly preserved aspects of the obliterated pharaoh's monuments while attempting to remove them. You grin at the irony, picturing an ancient overseer meticulously chiseling out names, only for later archaeologists to marvel at the very effort intended to destroy memory. The absurdity of history preserving what was meant to vanish is oddly satisfying. You wander past monuments bearing faint double crowns, traces of religious iconography, and hints of original inscriptions. Mainstream archaeology notes that erasures often coincide with changes in dynastic or theological agendas, as new kings sought legitimacy by discrediting predecessors? Historians still argue whether the practice significantly shaped collective memory, or if it primarily reflected elite concerns, while ordinary people continued to honor long-gone rulers in local tradition. A subtle, quirky detail: some erased pharaohs appear in graffiti, scribbled names, or doodles left by workers, as if common people quietly rebelled against official history. Fringe Egyptologists interpret these traces as evidence that memory and devotion persisted despite systematic suppression. You crouch over faint graffiti, imagining a laborer whispering the erased king's name while carving it secretly into stone. Small acts of resistance that echo across millennia. As dusk descends, the desert glows with deep amber, and you pause to take in the scattered ruins. Pharaohs erased by later kings are a haunting testament to power, memory, and human vanity. You probably won't survive fully grasping the audacity of deliberate obliteration. Yet standing among defaced monuments, hidden tombs, and ghostly outlines, you sense the delicate tension between erasure and remembrance. Tonight, you trace the vanished names and faint shadows of rulers who fought to exist in history, only to be methodically removed. And you are witness to the quiet persistence of memory against the odds. You walk along the limestone cliffs of Deir el-Bahari, the air heavy with the scent of sun-baked stone and distant incense. And tonight, you explore the enigma of Hatshepsut's contemporaries, those rulers who existed in parallel to her reign, yet remain frustratingly elusive. You probably won't survive without realizing that Egyptian chronology isn't a tidy line, but a tangled web of overlapping kings and queens. Yet tracing these shadows is exhilarating in a quiet, head-spinning way. Mainstream history recognizes Hatshepsut as one of Egypt's most successful female pharaohs, ruling during the 18th dynasty, while often presenting herself in male regalia. But evidence suggests that other rulers may have reigned concurrently, either in Upper Egypt on provincial thrones, or as rival claimants. You crouch beside a faintly carved relief, imagining scribes diligently recording offerings, while the court navigated political delicacies, aware that even a minor misstep could erase one's memory from the annals. Historians still argue whether these contemporaries were legitimate co-rulers, symbolic figureheads, or political rivals forced into obscurity. A quirky detail makes you grin. Some inscriptions depict minor officials or governors with elaborate headdresses, nearly rivaling Hatshepsut's own, suggesting a subtle assertion of status or influence. Fringe theorists even speculate that these contemporaries might have orchestrated campaigns behind the scenes, their deeds credited to Hatshepsut or erased altogether. You lean over a crumbling stela, imagining a shadowy figure plotting in a dimly lit chamber, while Hatshepsut's court basked in sunlight, unknowing of rival ambitions. You wander through tombs that appear stylistically aligned with her reign, yet bear names almost erased. Miniature funerary objects hint at connections, alliances, or familial ties, but the evidence is tantalizingly incomplete. Historians still argue whether these contemporaries were supportive allies, reluctant subjects, or rebellious challengers. You run your fingers over a tiny wooden boat, imagining it ferrying a deceased official, whose deeds have long been overwritten by political necessity. A fringe quirk, some contemporaries may have been women disguised as men in inscriptions, like Hatshepsut herself, to legitimize their rule or conform to tradition. You chuckle imagining an alternate universe where multiple female pharaohs navigated political hierarchies, secretly challenging the patriarchal assumptions of history. Their cleverness is almost cinematic, yet the stone retains only vague, ghostly outlines of ambition. Walking further, you notice evidence of co-regency, overlapping reigns indicated by fragmented inscriptions, regnal years, and ritual calendars. Mainstream archaeology emphasizes that co-regency was practical, ensuring smooth transitions of power and political stability. Historians still argue whether some contemporaries were placeholders for administrative convenience or truly autonomous rulers, operating in partial secrecy. You picture scribes juggling dates, names, and ceremonies with painstaking precision, aware that a single error could misrepresent an entire era. A subtle quirky detail. A few stelae depict scenes where a seemingly minor figure presides over ritual offerings, hinting at ceremonial authority that may have rivaled Hatshepsut's in certain domains. Fringe Egyptologists speculate these could reflect shadow courts, parallel administrations, managing parts of the kingdom under a different ruler's banner. You imagine a hidden chamber where a deputy pharaoh reviews grain reports, plotting silently, while the official ruler is distracted by monumental building projects. As twilight bathes the cliffs in golden light, you pause to observe the delicate balance of memory and erasure. The enigma of Hatshepsut's contemporaries illustrates how history often privileges the visible, monumental, and enduring, while parallel stories linger in whispers, partial inscriptions, and tiny artifacts. You probably won't survive the dizzying complexity of overlapping reigns without marveling at the subtle interplay of ambition, loyalty, and secrecy. Standing among tombs, stelae, and faint reliefs, you feel the pulse of political intrigue that thrived beside Hatshepsut, a hidden dimension of power that exists only for those patient enough to trace it. You trudge along the wide avenue of the Sphinxes, the scent of Nile mud and sun-heated stone heavy in your nostrils. And tonight, you seek the forgotten builders of Luxor, those anonymous laborers, artisans, and planners whose sweat and skill created monuments to pharaohs, now largely erased from memory. You probably won't survive without imagining the daily grind under the relentless sun. But these ghosts of labor are the lifeblood of Egypt's enduring splendor. Mainstream history acknowledges the immense scale of Luxor's temples, obelisks, and statues, attributing them to famous pharaohs. Yet the vast workforce behind these projects often remains nameless. You crouch beside a weathered wall, noticing faint marks where workers recorded measurements or left graffiti in hieratic script. Historians still argue whether these inscriptions were purely practical, personal signatures, or subtle acts of rebellion against the rigid hierarchies of royal authority. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some graffiti depicts humorous caricatures, stick figure laborers, wrestling, playing dice, or teasing each other in ways you wouldn't expect in the solemnity of temple construction. Fringe theorists suggest these images were morale-boosting, a secret language of the workforce, or even an early form of protest art. You grin, imagining exhausted stonecutters carving tiny pranks into sacred walls while overseers weren't watching. You wander past partially completed pylons and foundations, imagining crews of thousands dragging sandstone blocks, adjusting levers, and chanting rhythmically to synchronize effort. Mainstream archaeology notes that work gangs were highly organized, with specialized tasks divided among teams of masons, carpenters, and laborers. Historians still argue whether the workforce consisted primarily of conscripted peasants, professional laborers, or a combination, and how much choice they truly had in participating. A fringe quirk. Some builders' inscriptions include references to dreams, prayers, or personal grievances, hinting at inner lives rarely acknowledged in official histories. You crouch over a scratched note that seems to complain about the heat, the long hours, or a missed ration of bread. It's a tiny window into humanity, centuries old, reminding you that even monumental construction was powered by individuals with hopes, frustrations, and humor. Walking deeper into the complex, you notice remnants of temporary housing, kitchens, and storage areas, evidence of a bustling community supporting monumental projects. Mainstream history emphasizes that the logistics of Luxor's construction were staggering, requiring careful planning for food, water, and materials. Historians still argue how much autonomy the builders had, or whether every detail was micromanaged by scribes and foremen in the service of pharaohs now almost forgotten. A subtle, quirky detail, small votive figurines of animals or deities, are sometimes tucked into the corners of unfinished walls, perhaps left by workers to ensure protection, success, or a little divine favor. Fringe Egyptologists propose that these miniature offerings were personal rituals, separate from official temple worship, reflecting a private spiritual life that intersected subtly with public labor. You smile, imagining a mason secretly slipping a tiny cat figurine into a wall before his shift ended, a gesture unnoticed by the priests or pharaoh. As twilight settles over the sandstone temples, casting long shadows across hieroglyphs and carvings, you step back and appreciate the massive human effort invisible in official records. The forgotten builders of Luxor are the veins through which the kingdom's power and artistry flowed, enduring long after their names vanished. You probably won't survive the weight of realizing how much of Egypt's glory relied on invisible labor, but standing among walls, columns, and graffiti, you feel the pulse of countless hands and hearts shaping history quietly yet indelibly. Tonight, you walk alongside the ghosts of artisans, remembering that the monuments of kings are only as enduring as the toil of those who built them. You trudge across the scorched plains of Upper Egypt, the wind carrying a faint tang of Nile silt and distant incense. And tonight, you trace the shadow dynasties of the Second Intermediate Period, those ephemeral kings and regional rulers who ruled alongside, beneath, or against the official dynasties. You probably won't survive without feeling dizzy at the fragmented, overlapping reigns. But the intrigue lies in chasing rulers who left almost no permanent mark, existing in whispers and broken inscriptions. Mainstream history identifies the Second Intermediate Period, roughly 1650–1550 BCE, as a time of political fragmentation, with the Hyksos controlling the north, while native Theban kings maintained authority in the south. You crouch beside a fragment of a stele, imagining scribes recording tribute from small regional rulers, aware that their names might vanish in the next generation. Historians still argue whether the shadow dynasties were independent, semi-autonomous, or simply puppet regimes installed by stronger powers. A quirky detail catches your eye. Some stelae from this period depict unusually elongated figures or hybrid creatures alongside kings, possibly symbolic markers of legitimacy or divine favor. Fringe theorists speculate these images may represent ephemeral rulers, asserting supernatural authority to compensate for political weakness. You squint at a faint carving of a crocodile-headed king and imagine local elites insisting, if we look divine enough, maybe the other dynasties will leave us alone. You wander among fragmented palace foundations and small fortifications, remnants of local administrations struggling to assert sovereignty. Mainstream archaeology notes that rulers in both north and south adapted military and diplomatic strategies to survive, occasionally forming alliances or paying tribute to more powerful neighbors. Historians still argue whether these shadow kings ever aspired to unite Egypt again or contented themselves with temporary, localized authority. A fringe quirk. Some inscriptions hint at ephemeral co-regencies, rival claimants, or rulers who might have existed for only a few months. Fringe Egyptologists suggest that scribes sometimes exaggerated or minimized the reigns of these shadow dynasties to legitimize their own political masters. You grin, imagining a brief king reigning for mere weeks, signing decrees no one would read, only to be erased from the record immediately afterward. Walking further, you notice that some tombs appear modest, but contain unexpectedly rich goods, miniature boats, jewelry, or ceremonial figurines. Mainstream scholars believe these burials reflect both traditional funerary practices and attempts by minor rulers to assert legitimacy. Historians still argue whether the wealth reflects local prosperity, gifts from overlords, or simply the determination of families to survive politically and spiritually in turbulent times. A subtle, quirky detail. A few stelae depict councils of local elders alongside kings, suggesting shadow dynasties sometimes relied on collaborative governance rather than absolute rule. Fringe theorists propose these scenes may reflect early proto-democratic practices, or at least negotiated authority long before modern political thought. You crouch beside a carving, showing a small figure, gesturing emphatically toward a seated king, imagining debates over taxes, grain, or canal maintenance. Tiny dramas with consequences lost to time. As dusk settles, casting long shadows over eroded walls and fragmented reliefs, you realize that the Second Intermediate Period is a kaleidoscope of ephemeral kings, regional rulers, and political experiments. The shadow dynasties are enigmatic, often forgotten. Yet they reveal resilience, adaptation, and the complexity of power. You probably won't survive fully absorbing the dizzying patchwork of authority, but standing among ruined fortifications, tombs, and fleeting inscriptions, you sense the hum of ambition, compromise, and survival that pulsed beneath the surface of history. Tonight, you walk among ghosts of rulers who never dominated, yet whose fleeting presence shaped the trajectory of Egypt's civilization in ways both subtle and enduring. You trudge along the sun-baked Valley of the Kings, the scent of sandstone mingling with faint traces of resin and incense. And tonight, you track the obscure Tutankhamun contemporaries, those pharaohs, princes, and officials who existed alongside him, yet barely register in history. You probably won't survive without realizing that even the famous boy king had shadows around him, rulers and administrators whose names flicker briefly in inscriptions or artifacts, vanishing almost immediately from memory. Mainstream history celebrates Tutankhamun for restoring Egypt's traditional religion after Akhenaten's radical reforms. Yet records indicate other rulers or high-ranking officials governed simultaneously in various capacities. You crouch beside a fragment of a limestone stela, imagining scribes carefully noting tribute, religious offerings, and appointments, while the young pharaoh's advisors maneuvered in corridors of power. Historians still argue whether these contemporaries were true co-regents, regional governors, or opportunistic rivals, exploiting a period of political flux. A quirky detail: some tombs from this era contain tiny amulets or figurines depicting Aten alongside traditional gods, suggesting subtle political or religious compromise by minor rulers. Fringe theorists speculate these artifacts may have been secret signals, loyalty markers, or even protective charms designed to navigate a tricky ideological landscape. You grin, picturing a local governor slipping an Aten amulet under his robe, hoping the right god noticed his cautious devotion. You wander through partially excavated burial chambers, noticing names erased or overwritten on wall inscriptions. An intentional act, perhaps, to consolidate Tutankhamun's restored authority. Mainstream archaeologists note that officials' tombs were sometimes modest, yet contained carefully curated artifacts, cosmetic palettes, miniature boats, and symbolic tools. Historians still argue whether these contemporaries actively influenced policy or simply administered regional domains. While the pharaoh's court focused on religious restoration, a fringe quirk. Some artifacts depict minor figures with exaggerated proportions, like elongated limbs or enlarged eyes, possibly to convey authority, supernatural insight, or symbolic importance. Fringe Egyptologists propose that these representations indicate hidden status or personal prestige, reflecting power outside formal dynastic hierarchy. You crouch over a small figurine, imagining an ambitious administrator trying to assert importance in the shadow of a famous boy king. Walking further, you notice traces of co-regency hints in fragmented inscriptions, overlapping regnal years, and ritual calendars. Mainstream historians emphasize that succession and authority were rarely linear, and minor pharaohs or heirs might have ruled in tandem with nominally dominant figures. Historians still argue whether Tutankhamun's contemporaries were puppets, rivals, or essential collaborators, maintaining Egypt's fractured administration. You picture scribes carefully juggling dates and names, conscious that a single mistake could rewrite history. A subtle, quirky detail. Some funerary objects depict miniature depictions of court life, banquets, ritual dances, or administrative work, providing glimpses into daily operations under the shadow of a famous pharaoh. Fringe theorists suggest that these intimate scenes offer evidence of a functioning bureaucracy that persisted independently of Tutankhamun's personal reign. You smile, imagining a low-ranking courtier meticulously recording grain shipments while the boy king's image looms nearby, oblivious to the quiet orchestration around him. As twilight deepens, painting the valley in amber and shadow, you sense that these obscure contemporaries, though largely forgotten, were essential to the kingdom's stability. You probably won't survive grasping all the subtle power dynamics without marveling at the complexity of their interwoven authority. But standing among tombs, stelae, and faint inscriptions, you feel the pulse of ambition, administration, and survival that coexisted with Tutankhamun's fame. Tonight, you walk alongside the shadows of a court largely erased, tracing threads of governance, loyalty, and influence that flicker in and out of historical memory. You trudge across the sun-bleached plains of Egypt's Delta and Nile Valley, the horizon wavering in heat and mirage. And tonight, you search for the lost pharaohs of the late period, rulers whose reigns were brief, obscured, or intentionally erased amidst foreign invasions and political turbulence. You probably won't survive fully grasping just how fragile dynastic continuity became. Yet the thrill lies in piecing together fragments of kings and queens who fought to exist in memory at the very edge of recorded history. Mainstream history notes that the late period, roughly 664-332 BCE, saw Egypt repeatedly invaded by Assyrians, Persians, and eventually Macedonians, leading to fragmented authority and rapid turnover of rulers. You crouch beside a partially defaced stela, imagining a local pharaoh negotiating with both internal factions and foreign powers, trying to assert legitimacy while wary of the next invader. Historians still argue whether some of these fleeting pharaohs wielded true authority or merely served as figureheads for puppet regimes. A quirky detail: certain tombs of this era contain miniature bronze figurines of foreign soldiers or gods not traditionally Egyptian, suggesting an awareness or even a subtle embrace of foreign presence in daily ritual. Fringe theorists speculate that these items may have been protective charms or symbolic gestures intended to curry favor with both gods and conquerors. You grin, picturing a young king quietly slipping a Persian figurine into a temple corner, hoping it wouldn't offend the old deities. Walking through partially excavated palaces, you notice crumbling walls adorned with hastily painted reliefs, some barely finished, hinting at rulers who reigned too briefly to leave monumental legacies Mainstream archaeologists highlight that late-period kings often commissioned small-scale projects rather than massive temples, reflecting both political instability and resource constraints. Historians still argue whether these abbreviated reigns indicate internecine conflict, external pressure, or strategic adaptation to a precarious environment. A fringe quirk: a few inscriptions feature rulers with exaggerated crowns or hybrid animal depictions, possibly signaling divine favor or supernatural claims to authority. Fringe Egyptologists suggest these might have been attempts to compensate for limited temporal power, allowing a ruler to expand influence symbolically when actual control was tenuous. You crouch over a carving of a lion-headed pharaoh, imagining the irony: mighty in stone, fragile in reality. You wander among hastily prepared burial sites, noting small grave goods, ceramics, jewelry fragments, miniature boats, but little in comparison to earlier dynastic tombs. Mainstream scholars believe these modest burials reflect the era's instability, where kings could die young, be overthrown, or erased before completing grand projects. Historians still argue whether certain rulers disappeared intentionally from records or simply faded through neglect in the erasure of monuments by successors. A subtle, quirky detail: graffiti left by artisans or scribes in these tombs sometimes records frustration, jokes, or cryptic messages about rulers, suggesting that even amidst political upheaval, human levity persisted. Fringe theorists propose that these inscriptions reveal both covert resistance to authority and a desire to memorialize fleeting figures in private, informal ways. You smile, imagining an artisan carving a mocking image of a king for future generations, hidden behind mud brick walls. As dusk falls, painting the Nile's reflective waters in molten gold, you step back and observe the fragmented remains of palaces, tombs, and stelae. The lost pharaohs of the late period are reminders that history is not only shaped by longevity or fame, but by survival against chaos and memory's whims. You probably won't survive fully absorbing the transience and vulnerability of their reigns, yet standing among scattered inscriptions and eroded monuments, you sense the pulse of fleeting authority, fragile dynasties, and quiet resilience. Tonight, you walk among kings and queens who were almost forgotten, tracing the subtle threads that persisted through conquest, upheaval, and the slow erasure of time. You trudge through the modern deserts and excavation sites, the sun harsh on your shoulders and dust curling in every breeze. And tonight, you follow the echoes in modern discovery. Archaeologists, tomb hunters, and scholars who have unearthed fragments of pharaohs, dynasties, and religious figures lost to time. You probably won't survive without marveling at the delicate interplay between sand, stone, and human curiosity. But the thrill lies in seeing history's long shadows illuminated, if only briefly, by modern eyes. Mainstream archaeology celebrates breakthroughs like the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, the Valley of the King's hidden chambers, and the mapping of lost cities such as Tanis and Amarna. You crouch beside a partially excavated burial shaft, imagining the careful brushing of millennia-old dust from a limestone sarcophagus, each stroke revealing a fragment of life long forgotten. Historians still argue whether some finds represent true royal burials, regional rulers, or ritual symbolic constructions intended more for eternity than for history books. A quirky detail: in several digs, tiny animal figurines, miniature boats, and personal items once overlooked have provided unexpected insights into daily life, social hierarchy, and cultural exchange. Fringe theorists speculate that some trivial artifacts, like painted ostrich eggs or carved cosmetic palettes, may encode secret ritual knowledge or political allegiances lost to mainstream interpretation. You grin at the thought of an archaeologist lifting a fragment of pottery and whispering, "This might rewrite what we thought we knew," all while tiny Nile mud creatures scuttle around their boots. You wander among excavation grids, fragile scaffolding, and tool-marked stones, imagining the thrill of discovery, tempered by painstaking care. Mainstream scholars note that every object, no matter how small, contributes to reconstructing Egypt's complex dynastic and cultural tapestry. Historians still argue whether some modern interpretations overstate the significance of minor finds, or whether the small artifacts actually illuminate overlooked aspects of society. A fringe quirk: some excavated sites reveal hidden inscriptions beneath layers of plaster or paint, only visible through ultraviolet light or chemical analysis. These secret layers occasionally resurrect names of pharaohs thought lost, or reveal alternative versions of historical events. You crouch over a faint hieroglyph, glowing under a gentle UV lamp, imagining the relief whispering the names and deeds of rulers once erased, and the thrill of connecting with voices that slept for millennia. Walking further, you notice the blending of modern technology with traditional excavation. 3D scanning, ground-penetrating radar, and digital mapping reveal tombs, walls, and artifacts without ever disturbing them. Mainstream archaeology emphasizes that these tools allow us to respect ancient sites while unveiling secrets carefully hidden by sand and time. Historians still argue whether technology can truly capture the nuances of ritual, power, and human experience that ordinary eyes and hands might sense differently. A subtle, quirky detail: archaeologists occasionally find playful graffiti from ancient workers, doodles, jokes, or even small caricatures, offering glimpses into the personalities of those who labored unseen. Fringe theorists propose that these whimsical traces serve as timeless reminders that history was lived by humans with humor, frustration, and creativity, not just by kings and queens. You smile, imagining an ancient mason winking across centuries through a tiny etched cat or stick figure, and feeling connected to both laborer and scholar across time. As twilight settles over the excavation camp, lanterns casting a warm glow on tools and walls, you realize that modern discovery is both resurrection and reinterpretation. The lost pharaohs, shadow dynasties, hidden tombs, and forgotten builders persist not only in sand and stone, but in the careful observation, imagination, and persistence of those who study them today. You probably won't survive fully grasping the magnitude of centuries converging in a single brushstroke, but standing among artifacts, grids, and faint inscriptions, you feel history breathing through you. Tonight, the echoes of ancient Egypt resound in whispers, revelations, and quiet awe, connecting the distant past to your present awareness, reminding you that discovery is an endless conversation across time. You lean back, the day's sun finally cooling on the desert horizon, and let your mind drift over all the stories you've chased tonight. From pharaohs lost to time, to hidden tombs, shadow dynasties, obscure contemporaries, and forgotten builders, Egypt has revealed its secrets in fragments, whispers, and faded inscriptions. You probably won't survive fully comprehending how much of history is absence, erasure, oblivion, and forgotten effort. But that's the quiet thrill. The spaces between records tell stories just as vividly as the monuments themselves. Imagine walking through ruins, feeling the rough limestone under your fingertips, inhaling the dusty aroma of ancient temples, and listening for the faint echo of chants long silenced. Each artifact, every miniature figurine, crude graffiti, and erased name is a pulse of life surviving the desert's relentless erosion. You realize the names etched on walls are only part of the story. The anonymous builders, laborers, priests, and minor rulers carry the weight of civilization with courage, wit, and devotion. Their whispers still reach us through sand, pigment, and stone. The interplay of discovery and loss creates a delicate tension. Some pharaohs survive in grand monuments, while others vanish into shadow, yet even absence is meaningful. Modern archaeology peels back layers of time, illuminating hidden narratives and resurrecting forgotten faces. Every carefully brushed artifact and scanned inscription reminds you that history is not static. It is a dialogue across millennia, a bridge connecting curiosity, observation, and imagination. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the Nile shimmer under moonlight, temples standing silently, and hidden tombs holding secrets for centuries yet to be revealed. You probably won't survive without marveling at how ephemeral power and human effort are. But tonight you've witnessed the resonance of memory, the resilience of culture, and the enduring heartbeat of a civilization whose echoes refuse to be silent. Rest now, letting the soft hum of history cradle your thoughts. And remember, every shadow, every lost name is part of a story still waiting for discovery. Sweet dreams.